In this video, I'm going to teach you how Flexbox works. We'll start off by going through what's available to you, what it can actually do, and then we'll spend the rest of the video, which will be the majority of it, diving really deep into how Flexbox works, how do we calculate different things, and use all of the properties. My goal for this video is to be the most in-depth Flexbox tutorial on YouTube. And the reason I'm making it so in-depth is because it's important. I think that not only knowing Flexbox allows you to eliminate a lot of the frustration when it comes to layouts in CSS, but it'll also set us up for our next lesson, which is going to be on CSS Grid. Last thing before we get started, this is part of my Full Stack Web Developer Roadmap series, where we're learning to code and we're taking a full stack web app start to finish. So if you're interested in that, check out this video, also links in the description. So let's get started. This is a Flexbox crash course, and the prerequisites for it is going to be a basic understanding of HTML and CSS. I've covered all of this in prior lessons of this series, so go check those out if you're unfamiliar. Here's what we're going to be covering in this video. We're going to learn what Flexbox is, how it can help you out and make your life easier. We're going to go through all the basic properties of Flexbox, and we're going to get pretty detailed in those so that you really understand what's going on there. And then finally, we're going to look at a front-end mentor project, this testimonial grid over here, which we're going to be creating with Flexbox in the next video. A few of the things that we're not going to be covering. Shorthand Flexbox properties. So there's a couple properties within this CSS, module or framework or whatever you want to call it, that allow you to write less CSS to achieve the same thing. And that's not our goal here. We're trying to learn Flexbox. You can apply those much later down the road when you're more comfortable with Flexbox. And we're also not going to be getting very advanced with this. I have written advanced Flexbox properties, but we're pretty much covering all of the properties. I guess probably the better way to say that is we're not going to be going into advanced Flexbox methods and different layouts and all of that kind of stuff. My main goal is to get you understanding how the system works and get you very comfortable with using it. The obvious starting question is, what is Flexbox? Well, if you have been following along, you might have realized that as we're writing our CSS, there's really two main components. You have layout-related properties, and then you have style-related properties. So a style property would be like a color or a font or something like that. It doesn't really affect how things are laid out on the page, but layout properties do. That's how you create, grids and, nav bars and footers and sidebars, all of that kind of stuff. So far, we have not been using Flexbox, and our job has been a little bit difficult because we've had to use, hacky ways of getting layouts to work. Flexbox is going to come in and really help you out with that layout side of things. And per the MDN web docs, Flexbox is called the CSS Flexible Box Layout Module. And it's a model for displaying items in a single dimension, so either a row or a column. In future videos, we're going to get into CSS Grid, which is a two-dimensional layout module within CSS. And some, might say that CSS Grid is better than Flexbox or vice versa, but they really work together, and we're going to cover how those work together within our CSS. Whatever the case, Flexbox and then subsequently CSS Grid, which again is a future video, these are kind of the future of CSS layouts. So in the past, like I talked about, you had to use like floats and clear fixes and inline blocks and specific widths. And if you watched one of the previous videos, we had to almost, hack our way to getting items to fit within a container by removing white space from our HTML. These are not good solutions. They're not sustainable. And so Flexbox, along with CSS Grid, come in to provide a better model for doing layouts. But enough talk, let me show you exactly what we're dealing with here. So what I've got here is some basic HTML, and I really want you to start understanding this container-child relationship within HTML. So if we look at this, we can see that we have a div element with a class of container, and then we have three div elements all having the same class of item. This relationship is very important. The container is the parent to all three of these, children elements. To show you how this relationship is important, let's put some width and height dimensions. We'll go with 100 pixels for the width and height of the items within this container. and we'll give them a background color of, say, orange, and then maybe we'll give some margin of 5 pixels so they're kind of separate a little bit. So here you can see the 3 div elements. These are the children elements to that container. And the reason this parent-child relationship is so important is because the second you enable Flexbox on a container, all of the child elements become what we call flex items. So this is really important, and first off, let me show you what happens when we have the normal display property. So right now, by default, each item here and the container are all going to be a display type of block. So they're block elements, and you'll see as I type these in, it's not going to do anything because we're basically just explicitly writing in what was already the default. Now with block elements, as we talked about in prior CSS videos of the series, these are going to have certain characteristics, and flex items and flex containers are also going to have certain display characteristics. So if we remove this display block, which again, these are just defaults for div elements, and we come up to the container and we type display flex, you're going to notice that these items change. And the reason they change is because by adding this single property on the container element, or the parent, we are basically making a flex container which holds a bunch of flex items. The container and the items have specific characteristics that normal block or inline elements do not have. In just a minute, I'm going to explain exactly why these flex items are going in a horizontal direction rather than vertical, but for now I really want to drill home this point about flex containers and flex items. Now you might ask, well, if I set display flex on this container and all of these are going to be flex items, then can I also make the flex item a flex container? And the answer is yes. You can actually have an element be both a flex item and a flex container at the same time, and that's why it's important to always keep these relationships clear in your head. Let me show you what I mean. So if we come down to the final div element, which currently is just a flex item, and then we put in a few more divs. So let's put in a class of sub item, and then we're going to copy this down 3 times. And right now this doesn't have any dimensions, but if we copy this CSS selector of item down and then we put in sub item and give it some different dimensions, so we'll give it something very small, like maybe 15 pixels wide and tall, and then we'll make the background color blue and a margin of 1 pixel, something like that. And what you'll see is that these line up within that third container because they're children of this third flex item. But at the moment, these are not flex items themselves. They are block elements by default. This brings up a very important point. So if you look at our CSS, we have put the display flex property on this main container. And when we do that, it only turns that container into a flex item, and then the direct children, not all descendants, but only the direct children, will become the flex items. So in this case, all of these divs are going to be flex items, but the sub items are not going to be flex items. These will be the default block elements. Now, what I can do is I can come in and turn this final div into a flex container, which will then subsequently turn these sub items into flex items as well. Just so that I have a unique selector on here, let me turn this into item 3. We'll put another class on there. And then all we have to do is come down here on item 3 and write display flex. And what you'll see is these 3 blue boxes right here are going to go in a row just like the orange boxes are. As we go throughout this tutorial, I want you to keep this clear in your head, this exact model that we just laid out here. So let me just walk you through it one more time. At the top level, we have a div called with a class of container. This is a flex container, and the reason it's a flex container is because we put the display flex property on it. Now all of the items, these 3 items right here, these are flex items. And the reason they're flex items is because their direct parent is a flex container. Now, these sub items right here, these are also flex items, but it's not because we have display flex on the main container, it's because we've put display flex on this third item right here. I know this is confusing right now. It's going to get a lot more clear as we go through the tutorial, but what's happening here is this third div within the container is both a flex container and it's a flex item. So it can actually serve as both types at the same time. In relation to the main container, it is a flex item. In relation to these sub-items, it is a flex container. With that level of understanding between the container and the flex item and how we can combine those, here are the flex container and flex item properties that you can use. We're going to go through each of these, but you have to keep them very clear in your head when you're going through, because you have to first identify, am I dealing with a container or an item? And as you saw, in some cases, you can be dealing with both, so you can actually put a combination of these properties on a single HTML element. Sometimes this gets a little bit confusing, and something that I had done when I was first learning Flexbox is I had this cheat sheet that I found here. It's a really great resource. I'll be sure to link to it in the description, but I just keep this open whenever I'm working with Flexbox because it's very interactive. You can, click on different things and see how different flex properties work, and it covers pretty much everything. Now, as I just mentioned, some properties apply to the container and some to the items. This resource does not really separate that out on the left side right here, but for each property, you'll come down and you can see what it applies to. So this one applies to flex containers. So I'd use this resource, keep it open as you're learning Flexbox. It's a really good, little cheat sheet to have. In addition, as we've been going through in this course, you can always look it up on MDN Web Docs. So as you can see, we're on Flexbox, and here's the property reference for all of the valid properties that we can use. And you can click on each of them and kind of get an overview of what's available. And what I'll point out is this formal definition down here for each property is going to tell you what the initial value is. And sometimes that's important to understand what the default values you're dealing with are. The reason understanding these default values is so important is because when we have flex items and flex containers like this, putting this single rule on a container is going to set a bunch of properties by default that you're not seeing, in front of you. In reality, when we put display flex on this container, it's setting all of the properties that I just pasted in here. So it's setting a flex direction, justify content, align content, items, and flex wrap. And these are all of the default values, so you can see that nothing changed over here on the left because they were already applied by default. Likewise, flex items have default properties. So I can come down to the item itself, which is going to be a flex item, and paste in all of these properties right here. And the reason nothing changed on the left, again, is because these are the defaults that that Flexbox comes packed with. What we're going to do in this tutorial is learn how we can modify the default values on all of these properties right here to get the intended result that we want. The last thing I want to point out before we jump into our first property is just a quick note on shorthand flex properties. So if we came down to the flex item, so this is targeting one of our flex items here, and we put in something called flex, and we gave it a value of, 0, 1, and auto. This right here is what we call a shorthand flex property. And it is the exact equivalent of writing flex grow 0, flex shrink 1, and flex basis of auto. So these three properties written out longhand is the same thing as this single property written out shorthand. And for this tutorial, like I said, we're not going to be looking at these shorthand properties because we have enough to deal with the longhand properties, just understanding how they work. So just wanted to clarify that because you might see that in the Flex cheat sheet. So if you came down here, Flex flow is a shorthand property. I'm sure Flex is somewhere on here. But whatever the case, just know that those exist, but we're not going to be covering them. I think at this point I've covered all of these, prerequisite pieces of knowledge to really jump into Flexbox. Let's go ahead and get started. We're not going to use this because it's pretty ugly and I actually put together a little demo here. So you can check out the JavaScript for this. It's basically just toggling some of the values here. And what this demo is meant to explain is the main tenet of Flexbox, and that is the fact that we have one-dimensional model where we can align items on either the horizontal or vertical axis. As you'll see in the HTML, we've got some HTML up here. None of this is really important. What we're really focused on here is going to be this piece right here. So we've got our main container, which is going to be our flex container, and then each of these divs are going to be the actual flex items. And I've actually styled these a little bit just for visual purposes, but it's not important to this tutorial. So if we're looking at this HTML, the way that we create a flex container of this div is by selecting it with CSS and writing display flex on it. So by default, that's going to create a flex container, and then all of the direct children are going to be the flex items. So all three of these divs right here. Now, the next property that we have to understand, and this is a really important part of Flexbox, is the flex direction property. And this is by default going to be set to row. What this property is defining is what we're going to be using as the main axis and what we're going to be using as the cross axis. I've written this out with HTML and CSS, so you can see that this is the main axis horizontally, and this is the cross axis vertically. But what happens is if you change this flex direction property, you're going to change the flow of the items within the flex container. And when you do that, that's also going to change the main and the cross axis. So by default, this is set to row, which means everything is going to go horizontal and the main axis is going to be horizontal. But if we were to toggle this flex direction, which is going to, via JavaScript, change the flex direction to column, then what's happening is the main axis is going to be vertical and the cross axis is going to be horizontal now. So now we're looking vertically, while previously when it was set to row, we're looking horizontally. So as we learn new properties, keep two things in mind. First off, as we talked about, you got to know which HTML element is the flex container and which are the flex items. Number two, you have to know which direction the flex items are going to flow in. So if you've got this property flex direction set to row, they're going to go horizontal and the main axis is going to be horizontal. And if you set it to column, it's going to flow vertically and the main axis is going to be vertical. As you can see in this example, our flex container has a certain height and width, and the reason is because we set it down here. So if we find the container that we set it on, we set the width and height to 300 and 200 pixels. Now, if we comment these out, we get rid of the dimensions on the container, it's going to act similar to a block element where it kind of spans the width of its parent container, and then the height is going to be based on the content of the items within it. To keep things simple, we're going to keep this width and height set on our container just so that we can have a nice visual to look at as we explore some of the different flex properties. For the remainder of the tutorial, we're going to be working here in this workspace, and I want to just kind of derive how I got here just so that you're not confused with pre-existing styles that I put on here. So what I have is basically 4 div elements within a main container. And as of right now, what I'm showing you, there's no Flexbox enabled here except on these items right here, but that's not what we're trying to cover. So these are basic divs, and as of right now, they're displaying as block elements, and there's no dimensions on the container. So let me kind of derive how we get to our workspace. First off, I'm going to set a width and a height on our main flex container, and I'm going to put a border on it. So just uncommented those properties out, and what you'll see here is a black border that is 4 pixels in dimension, and then the width itself is going to be 408 pixels on the whole container. The reason that it's 408 is because if you add the left border of 4 pixels and the right border of 4 pixels, that gets you 8 pixels, and therefore what I wanted to do was basically make the total area within the container 400 pixels exactly, so that we have a better time doing, basic calculations. So that's why I made it 408 pixels. Now we have to uncomment the display flex to make these flex items. So now you're seeing that they're sitting, on the horizontal axis, and that's actually because of the flex direction row default setting here. And this is how we get to our basic workspace. And then finally, I will uncomment these 2 lines of HTML, which are going to be styled somewhere down here so that we can see the cross and the main axis at all times. And as we go through the rest of the tutorial, we're always going to be working with a flex direction of row. So therefore, the main axis is always going to be horizontal and the cross axis is always going to be vertical. If you want, you can switch this and call it flex direction column, and you can see how all of these rules that we're about to go through work out from a vertical axis perspective. Believe it or not, you pretty much understand the core tenets of Flexbox. Everything past this point is just going to be kind of icing on the cake. It's going to really help you understand the power of Flexbox and how we can manipulate these flex items within their flex container.